Hey everyone, and welcome back to Ideanthro. Now today we are here for part 2 of this 2-part series with Alan Hoban and this lovely trash rack and sediment pond and all things beautiful like this. So in part 1 we explored Alan's process when he comes to investigate really any site, but using this particular site as a template to kind of explore Alan's process of how he investigates the site, how he tries to understand it, the things that he does, and so on. But in part 2, we're going to talk more specifically about what we actually found, what the challenges are, and then maybe attempt to talk about solutions. And I say maybe because only a minute ago, just off camera, Alan was like, look, you know we don't have a clear solution to this, right? So we're going to try and talk solutions, but I think the merit to this is in the process of talking through what's wrong and what might be options to it. Yeah, so why don't we spell out what we think the challenge is with this particular site?
Yeah, sure. I assume that the challenges here are largely about the lake that sits beyond this trash rack that's got significant declared aquatic weeds through its albinia. And that affects the amenity of that system, maintenance costs for council, and so I'm seeing that as the primary receiving environment to be taken care of.
Yep.
And then working back through.
Yeah. So you're viewing this as a, if again, and we're talking about this in a hypothetical, but if this were a real job, we're talking about this from the context of you might have been called out as a consultant because the council needs some advice about how to help the lake out, and then you're looking a bit back up the catchment here and going, okay, here's a something. What do we need to do with this something?
Yeah,
so,
or it might also be council saying, look, we've got asset management issues with this system.
Okay.
But if you come up from that side, you need to sort of understand, well, what's its purpose and function, and
gotcha.
Why is this thing here?
Okay. So coming with that, what have we? Let's fill out literally what we have here. So
we've got an inline wet sump trash rack that's receiving runoff from a fairly large urban catchment, mostly residential, low density residential catchment. Drains down through sort of semi-naturalised waterway, and then through this system here. I've seen some photos of this not so long ago when it was full of organic debris, and so it's obviously been cleaned out fairly recently.
So you mentioned it was a wet sump trash. I have a funny feeling that's going to be a fairly important part of this conversation. Why is wet sump important? And what is wet sump is the fact that it has a constant pool of water in front of the metal grates.
Yeah.
Why is that important?
Well, it's important. Probably about 10, 15 years ago, there was, around with stormwater quality, this assumption that everything in stormwater is a problem, and so we need to pull all of it out, no matter how.
Okay.
And so the early iterations of stormwater quality measures were largely gross pollutant traps, dealing with the stuff that you could see, and big focus was on keeping drink cans, plastic bottles, plastic bags out of the stormwater system.
And so by gross pollutants we mean large. Not gross as icky, but like big, chunky
technically
things.
You say anything bigger than 5 millimetres.
Okay. Yeah, so chunky stuff. So, but that can also include organic matter and like leaves and branches and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah, and so what's become a bit of a problem is in trying to take those chip packets and litter out of the stormwater system. And we didn't really know this until we started to capture stormwater, but 90 to 95% of the material that's coming off this catchment that falls into that gross pollutant category is likely to be leaf litter from the trees, and you can see that throughout the catchment, big rafts of leaves and organic material.
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges when that organic material gets held in a wet environment, and it's held there for more than a few days and not cleaned out, it starts to decompose anaerobically. And there's not a lot of data on this, but wherever there is data, you see really significant increases in soluble nutrients downstream of these wet sump gross pollutant traps and trash racks.
And so that's where you're tying back into the downstream environment is a shallow urban lake, right? Because that's really relevant to that downstream environment.
Yeah, correct.
And the relevance of that is, I mean, we saw in the first video the salvinia that's present across the top of the lake, which grows again in those urban lakes when there's plenty of nutrients available, and it grows like crazy. So the fact that you have a wet sump here that can be releasing nutrients ties into that story of you then have a lake with a declared aquatic weed blooming apparently regularly.
Yeah. Now the confusing part of this comes in, well, quite simply, what would happen if you took this out?
Okay.
This is holding organic material, it's decomposing, causing issues. So maybe you just take that out because you, but if you do that, then all that organic material is just going straight to the lake.
Yeah, just ends up in the lake, and the lake's this really big body. It's going to capture, most likely going to capture it anyway,
and build up a big organic layer there.
Okay.
So there's a. So for my mind, I then start thinking, well, how can I keep the organic material out of here?
Okay.
And looking back up into the catchments, really, where your easiest solutions start to form.
Okay. So what sorts of, so in the first video you talked about as you were driving in, you were spotting leaf litter in the gutters and this sort of thing. What sorts of solutions are forming up in your mind?
Well, a couple of things come to mind. Cut all the trees down.
Wonderful. We'll cut that here. Solution.
But if you can change the effectiveness of that drainage system, so you're holding back that leaf litter within the catchment, and one of the best ways of doing that is with swales.
Okay.
So you can use curbside swales instead of a concrete curb and channel system.
Okay.
And they can help retain that leaf litter, help it decompose in situ back up closer to where it falls.
Why is that? Why is it better that it decomposes in the swale in situ? Because like surely the stormwater flows through the swale and will pick up the decomposing matter. Why is that different?
Oh, well, a lot of it will decompose, form a mulch layer within that swale. Particularly in a catchment like this, you're likely to have sort of treed and more natural looking sort of bushy swales.
Okay.
So you can capture that organic material. It can decompose in an aerobic environment. You're actually returning those nutrients to the soil.
Okay.
So there's all that.
So there's something about the fact that it's decomposing aerobically in the swale as opposed to in this water here anaerobically.
Yeah, that's right. And if you look at a natural forest, most of the leaf litter falls and decomposes in and around the trees.
Yeah, in the spot.
So
Yep.
it's a natural thing of that sort of leaf litter that we form. And occasionally under a big storm, some of that will get washed away. But most of that's decomposing, it's supporting soil fertility, and it's sort of almost where it's meant to be in a way.
Yeah, I mean, people who know me know that in the context of like bioretention systems and that sort of thing, I'm a big fan of trees and for exactly that reason, in that a natural ecosystem does require, you know, that cycling of organic carbon through it, which happens through, you know, leaf drop and the like. So, okay, so I can see some sense in that. So, roadside swales is one option. Cutting down all the trees is another.
Okay, let's put that onto the bad idea, and we'll throw that away. It's good to have ideas that you put on the scrap heap.
Yep.
Cut down the trees. So the swales. The other one is then, but difficult to retrofit. So it really comes like, if you got the chance to redesign this area again, what would you do?
Yep.
So swales is one. Also just minimising runoff is always a great thing to do. So rainwater tanks or ways to get downpipes onto gardens and minimising the amount of stormwater runoff will also limit the amount of pollution we see at these sort of sites.
And is that because it's literally, there is not enough water to transport some of this organic matter? Is that what, you know, it takes the storm that is big enough to move the leaf litter happens less regularly?
Yeah.
So you get less regular transport into here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty simple equation. Less stormwater, less crap being carried in it.
Okay.
The other one is then start to looking at the gully pits. And one of the products I really like are the litter baskets that you can retrofit into side entry pits.
Okay.
Now, you don't want to put them everywhere in your catchment.
I was going to say, like several maintenance practitioners just screamed when you said this, right?
They hate it, and especially there's probably a couple of thousand gully pits, but there are some hot spots through here that we can easily see. So there's probably 5 to 10% of the gully pits here would be responsible for a lot of that leaf litter. You can really see where that is.
How can you see where that is?
Just drive around and
Okay, so coming back to this looking around the catchment?
Yeah, so drive around the catchment, and you get to see that, because there's more manicured areas where you're getting less leaf litter, and there's some other areas where there's a lot of trees.
Okay.
So there might be a couple of sites that you can put them in. The benefit of those is that they hold that litter, the organic litter, in a dry state.
Yeah, because it's suspended. It's not sitting in the bottom of the pit, like akin to this at the bottom.
So you don't have to clean them out after every storm event. Ideally you clean them out several times a year, but even if you only clean them out once or twice a year, you're still ahead of the game, because what you do capture, you're actually taking that material out of the system.
Okay.
So I think there's a big space for those, and there's maintenance cost, and that's sort of one of the things that it's a bit of a bitter pill to swallow, with stuff that there's no.
It's an
There's
interesting...
very few solutions that are easy to implement at low cost with no maintenance and everyone loves.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and because ultimately this is coming back around to, we have a lake here, which is a community asset. This is really well used. Obviously we're here in the middle of the day and it's pretty quiet, but the lake downstream of this is really well used, but has a weed issue to it. So it's how, so if we just look at the gully baskets on their own, they are just a cost. But if you look at them in the context of the lake, then maybe they are a cost to maintain the lake as something functional.
Yeah.
But you have that added layer of complexity. Well, this lake is 10 years old. It's going to have a nutrient, load that's already sitting in the sediments, possibly a large enough load to keep it turning over as a weed-infested lake for quite a long time to come, even without any more inputs. There's complexity in that. Like, you could implement the most whiz-bang option to stop any more, organics ever coming into this system, and that will still be weed-infested.
Yeah.
For the next 10, 20 years, whatever, indefinitely perhaps.
And I think there's an important part of professional honesty required there from practitioners to be honest about that, because, and to not sell some sort of fantastic solution saying, well, this is going to fix it.
Yeah.
Because some of these problems are really difficult, and there will be environmental issues for decades as a result of inherently bad urban design.
Sure. Okay, so we've got several options here, and cycling back around to, well, we were just kind of talking about it there in a sense, that we don't have a clear, definitive solution.
Yeah.
If this were a job that you were doing for a council, how would you deal with it? At this point, you've come through, you've got some ideas. How do you then deal with that? Oh, there's no one clear answer sort of thing.
So I reckon it's important to put all the bad or unpalatable solutions on the table as well.
Okay, why's that?
There's inherent compromises, and I think one of the roles of the consultant should be to appropriately reflect those and engage people in that decision-making process.
Yeah.
So to not necessarily dismiss things.
Well, and this is one of those things about prioritising projects where I think sometimes there's a little bit of misunderstanding, and I know I've seen David Pennell articulate this quite well, which is that when we're prioritising projects, it's not like, you're not looking at other projects, you need to take this look at what would happen if we did nothing and compare all the projects to doing nothing and look at the change.
Yeah.
And so unless you're there looking at, well, what is the current status quo and what are all the options, including the bad ones, you can't get a real feel for, like, the best option you have might still be a bad option, but unless you articulate all the other bad options, you can't know that it's the best. Like, there's something in that. You've just got to, the best solution still might not be good, but it is still the best.
Yeah. Because one option here is to get rid of that lake.
Yep.
It's on the card.
That's going to go down nicely with the community.
So a couple of things with this system. So you'd start to work down to try to, in my view, this is sort of old thinking, and so can we avoid the need for it, would be the first point. By doing things in the catchment to education and behaviour change, and as well as dealing with that litter load. But then when you get to a system like this, it's sort of also worth thinking about what it's got going for it.
Okay.
It's easy to maintain. There's a ready access path coming in here. It's easy for councils' vehicles to pull up. They can access this system really easily. There's a lot of space to dewater any material that they pull out. So
so it could be worse than it is.
Oh yeah, it could be a lot worse. We see some of these that are really inaccessible.
Well, yeah, some of the options that we looked at to do this video, like one of them, I sent it to you and I was like, we can get to it, but it's going to be troubling. Like,
yeah.
Okay.
So you can get to it. This idea of wet litter capture is really sort of 10, 20-year-old thinking.
Yep.
It really disappoints me that we still see a lot of these being put forward, or wet sump GPTs going in urban environments.
Yep.
So I'd then be thinking, well, how can we make this a dry capture system?
Okay.
And essentially trying to remove the permanent water so that any of the organic material that's caught here is
at least it's dry.
Is as dry as possible, and then you're not getting that anaerobic decomposition of that material.
Yep.
And it means when you do come and clean it out, you're taking most of that material.
Yeah, is the aerobic decomposition like slower? Is that kind of, or what is the benefit there of it being aerobic as opposed to anaerobic?
Oh, look, there's a couple of factors. One's that just the nutrients that are held in the organic matter, and so when they break down, great experiment. Grab a bucket of leaves, add some water, keep it at home and just observe it over the course of a month.
Okay.
And see what happens to.
So do side by side, one with water, one without, and see.
Yeah,
see
sure,
the difference? Okay. Yeah.
And observe what's happening to that water. You might want to put a cover on it so you're not breeding mosquitoes.
Sure. Yep.
But it'll give you like a first-hand account of how that system's behaving.
Okay.
One of the other problems with the anaerobic decomposition, we get very low dissolved oxygen levels.
Okay.
And so contaminants that are otherwise bound to clays and particles can be released because
you're thinking metals, maybe phosphorus.
Metals and phosphorus,
yep.
Yeah. So we can change that redox potential. And there's some data showing higher concentrations of those contaminants as a result of being held in a wet state.
Okay, right.
So the data, well, science tells us that if you don't want that to occur, you need to clean these things out almost within 48 hours of a major storm event.
Which is ridiculous. Yep.
So it's not going to happen.
Okay, so you're trying to dry this out. What might you do to dry this system up?
One of the things you could do quite simply is fill this thing in with concrete.
Yeah, so up to the level of the base of the trash rack.
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking?
But you want to think about how you are diverting flows around it, so that one of the systems I really like, if we're allowed to name brand names.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'm fine with this.
But have a look at the Baramy website. I think they have some good concept designs with some cross veins to deflect the litter off into the side basket.
So you're thinking when the next storm then comes along, it's not flushing the litter through,
yeah.
It's sitting off to the side.
Yeah, and you also need to think about what's happening hydraulically, because if you're capturing a whole raft of litter right across that flow channel, what's that likely to do in terms of flood levels, and is that going to cause a problem to any of the adjacent properties?
Okay, sure.
So keeping it in a dry state is definitely a better way to go if you can do it.
Okay.
And for clean out, you're not dealing with wet sludge. It's much easier to then take out and
don't have to de-water. Because I got to admit, when you were saying, oh, the access is great to this, I was thinking, well, I'm not sure the maintenance people are going to agree because there's water here. Like, that's still really irritating. So I can see the merits of if it's dry, you can take it straight away. Disposal costs, because if it's wet, you either have to de-water and make 2 trips, and it's got to sit around for a bit, or you've got to dispose of it wet.
And it stinks when it sits around.
Yeah, or you've got to dispose of it wet. So I can see the merit in keeping it dry, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's probably a relatively low cost adaptation. It might cost you $5,000 to retrofit to a system like this.
Yeah, but the money that people are spending per year, like councils are spending per year cleaning this stuff, by the time you've got potentially sucker truck hire or digger hire, depending on how you're trying to transport this, and some time with people, it's not going to take many cleans to recoup that, is it?
No, quite often local governments are spending in the vicinity of $6,000 per clean out for a system like this, and probably twice a year.
Yep.
So yeah, you could get your money back very quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we've talked through the problem. We talked through some catchment challenges, not challenges, like potential solutions up in the catchment. We talked about kind of a more technical fix down here. Are there any other things we should be considering?
Well, the pond immediately downstream of here, you could reconfigure, and you could try to reconfigure that into a constructive wetland system.
Okay.
And the benefit of the constructive wetland systems is you're then using much more biological processes to then deal with the pollutant loads coming in, and particularly the organic matter coming in.
Okay.
And where you get really good wetland plant coverage, you get much better oxygenation into the sediments.
Okay.
And so you can start to process those nutrients more effectively, and particularly any of the nitrates, to bring them right through the nitrogen cycle into nitrogen gas.
Okay.
So that would be an ideal.
Yep.
Some of my big concerns about a wetland in this sort of context would be...
You're going to say birds, aren't you?
Yeah, there's birds. So we've already seen, with very little sort of desirable habitat, swamp hens, ducks and ibis.
Yep. And
they can very quickly colonise constructive wetlands.
Yeah.
And
This is one of the big challenges we're seeing with wetlands is those birds colonising and then nesting sites, chomping down on the desirable veg, flattening it out.
Yeah.
The veg, might last a year, maybe two, but at some point it's expended all its energy and just can't deal with that bird life anymore.
Yeah.
Yep.
So no matter how well, what a software model might tell you about how that system's going to perform, like music, it just doesn't account for that. And you can get constructed wetlands right, but the majority of them fall over after a few years, and we've still got a lot to learn about how to get constructed wetlands right.
Yeah, I've got to admit, as much as it pains me to say it, with my kind of asset management hat on, I'm like, I love constructed wetlands, but God, they concern me when there's birds around, particularly. Just that constant, the plants can buffer it for a while, and then they've used up all their energy stores, and they're just like, sorry, I can't deal with this.
So other considerations with the wetland here is there's very little scope for a high flow bypass.
Yep.
So I haven't done any hydrologic analysis on this catchment, but I'm assuming you get a fair bit of water come through this area.
Yeah, we need to assume that because it's a reasonable channel, just the shape of the land here.
So you want to do some checks there and work out, well, what's the likely velocities through there and how damaging are they likely to be? And the other one, people often assume that you just throw some plants in water and call it a wetland and you'll get good water quality outcomes. It's sort of a bit of a magic cake recipe. But the amount of area we've got there to put a wetland in, compared to the size of the catchment, I suspect it's probably a fraction of a percent of the catchment area.
Yep.
And so how much treatment you're actually going to get through that wetland, you need to be really honest about as well, to try to then say, well, what do we genuinely think you'd get as a water quality
I've got to
outcome?
admit, when you first suggested wetland there, my first thought was, despite the fact that I love it, it's going to be a lot of money for how much additional benefit in that particular situation was my first initial.
So are we back to cutting down the trees in the catchment? No.
I thought you had some, well no, I thought you had gully baskets first. Maybe gully baskets are the answer here.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Now there might be some other things you could do along this drainage line to progressively try to hold back some of that organic litter as well.
Okay.
So it's worth thinking about how that's happening and where some of the lateral stormwater pipes coming into this gully line come out.
Okay.
And there's an opportunity for dry capture of that material coming out at those pipe outlets.
Okay.
Either with some swales or vegetation, or potentially, some litter baskets on those pipe outlets. There might be some other things you can do.
Yep.
I tend to think that the more you put all your eggs in one basket, the more likely you are to have some really bad outcomes. So the more you can distribute your solutions, the more resilient.
Why do you say that? What is it about the centralised thing that makes you uneasy there?
Look, we know a lot about the theory of water-sensitive urban design, and you would experience this as well travelling around. It's hard to be completely confident. There's so many variables about plants and stormwater and site context that might influence how well the system performs in a particular site.
Okay.
And when we spread that out over a catchment, we're sort of spreading our risk in a way. And more often than not, when I see larger treatment systems at the bottom end of catchments,
okay,
there's something that tends to fail. More often than not.
So in some respects I feel that I agree with, but in some respects I don't. So I have some real concerns about when you get right down the end of a really big catchment and you got truly massive systems. So we're talking bioretention systems of several thousand square meters, that sort of thing. Maybe I've, this is actually a pretty big catchment. Maybe the size of thing that we'd be talking about here would be of that sort of scale. So maybe I'm on the same page, maybe I'm not. I tend to feel that some level of centralisation, like a precinct scale type of thing, a couple of hundred square metres if it was bioretention, for me feels like a sweet spot because it's big enough that you're not getting too many edge effects coming in for weeds and that sort of thing. It's not so big that the flows are massive and causing it real problems. I think there's a balance there.
I'd agree on that scale. Sort of bioretention, no bigger than about 500 square metres ideally.
Yep.
Unless there's a really compelling reason. Or another way to think about it is sort of in terms of catchment area, sort of, the scale of that catchment. But it also comes into the maintenance capacity of local government, the solution. So I guess in some ways there's no recipe or formula. It's important to look at each.
Which is why I was glad that we did both this video and the first video in this series, kind of looking at. I think the benefit is in the process. It's like there's not one clear solution to this stuff, but if we can get better at the process of investigating and sussing things out, then that's more likely to lead us to be able to pick the right solution at the right time in the right place.
Yeah.
For sure. Okay. Do you have any?
Well, I guess the other part of that is then taking other people along for the journey, because we've just gone through a whole cycle in our head, conversation about the issues and factors, and so.
Well, this is what I love about doing this with the video, right? Is like how often, even at conferences or that sort of thing, how often do people actually sit down and just talk honestly about the processes and stuff?
We could have done this, or maybe,
Yeah, like there's not that much of it going on, and that's what I really love about this, is the ability just to go out and go, oh, let's throw some ideas around. We're not telling you this is right or wrong for here, but let's discuss it, and let's discuss how we think about it, because then we can replicate those processes, which I think's valuable.
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. Any final thoughts, or shall we wrap it up there?
The other thought for me, we've talked about sort of end of pipe solutions, but when you start going back up into the catchment, the ultimate for me is then going back to the houses.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
And I've just come back from a few days in Darwin, and one of the really fascinating things there is so many of the houses don't have gutters.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because of the cyclones and that intense rainfall, that they just get overwhelmed when they get major downpours. But what that's effectively doing, if we think in our sort of water-sensitive urban design spaces, it's disconnecting all those roofs. Water shoots off the roof onto their gardens, and you're not getting that direct connection into the stormwater system.
But like, I'm just putting like a really cynical kind of stormwater drainage. Like, is no one like, oh, you're worsening things for your neighbour, or like, naturally that ground was pervious and now you've got a roof and it could flow onto your neighbour's property. Like, is there none of that going on, or?
Well, up there, it's a convention and norm that water falls in that way.
Yep. Now, don't get me wrong. I've disconnected my downpipes. Yeah. Sorry, council. And so, like, I'm supportive of this, but
and it's not for everywhere. So often when you suggest something, people think, oh, what happens if that happens everywhere, and what's the worst thing that could happen? But there is potential in certain areas for us to think beyond some of our traditional sort of technology and widget style solutions to the stormwater problem.
I like this, and maybe this is something, I won't take us off on this tangent now, maybe this is something for another video, because there's something in this about how our current setup of stormwater objectives drive practices and solutions to stormwater management on the subdivision, but not at the lot scale, because in Queensland this disconnection between the planning process deals with the subdivision itself, and then the Queensland Development Code does the buildings, and
so we lose so many opportunities.
So but we won't go there right now. We'll save that for another one.
Excellent.
Okay, cool. Look, thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Ideanthro. Thank you, Al, for your thoughts. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to talk this sort of thing through. I really like that. If anyone wants to find out more about what it is that you do, this is your opportunity to plug either. It's like, what should people do to find you?
You can look up the Blytanner website, which has my contact details, so blytanner.com.au.
Okay, wicked, cool. Okay, thanks for tuning in. If you would like to know more about what it is we do, if you have ideas for episodes, so if you've watched this and been like, I'd really like to know about that, you can find us online at ideanthro.com. We've got our contact details there. You can shoot us a line, ask a question. You can also find us on Facebook and on Instagram these days, and on YouTube. Cool. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks, Al.
Thanks, Jack.
We'll speak to you all soon. Cheers.